The Mizpah Hotel stood like a sentinel in the desolate town of Tonopah, Nevada. Its stone facade bore the weight of history, etched with tales of fortune, tragedy, and more than a little mystery. Once the tallest building in Nevada, the Mizpah was a hub of life in the early 1900s, where miners, gamblers, and drifters flocked to seek their fortunes. Time had worn its grandeur, but it remained a haunting presence, steeped in stories of the supernatural. It was 2003 when Chris Dwyer and his wife, Sarah, found themselves checking into the Mizpah Hotel. They were travelers, with a taste for visiting old, forgotten places. The allure of the hotel's history was impossible to resist, especially the tales of its most famous ghost, the Lady in Red. As they stepped into the dimly lit lobby, the scent of old wood and worn carpet filled the air. A brass chandelier hung low, casting golden light on the aged wallpaper. Behind the check-in desk, a young woman greeted them with a knowing smile. "First time at the Mizpah?" she asked. Chris nodded, feeling a strange chill despite the warmth of the room. "We heard it's got quite a history." The woman handed them their keys. "Room 502. 5th floor. You'll find the elevator just around the corner." Sarah glanced at Chris, a flicker of excitement in her eyes. "Isn't that where the Lady in Red was murdered?" The woman's smile faded slightly, her eyes darkening with something like caution. "That's the story. Some say she still walks the halls at night. But don't worry, she only bothers the people who aren't supposed to be here." They exchanged polite chuckles, but the weight of her words lingered in the air as they took the keys and headed to the elevator. The Mizpah's elevator, a relic from another era, creaked as it ascended. The doors opened to the 5th floor with a heavy clunk, and they stepped into a long, narrow hallway lined with crimson carpets and faded wallpaper. The air felt thicker up here, as though the weight of history pressed down on them. As they walked, their footsteps echoed unnaturally in the empty hall. Room 502 was at the end of the corridor, its door adorned with a brass number plate. Chris unlocked the door, and they stepped inside. The room was smaller than expected, with a large, antique bed dominating the space. A gilded mirror hung on one wall, and a window overlooked the main street of Tonopah, its lights twinkling faintly in the gathering dusk. "Well, it's got character," Chris remarked, dropping his bag by the bed. Sarah laughed and walked to the window, peering down at the quiet street below. "I wonder if we'll see her," she mused, half joking. Chris shrugged. "Ghost or not, we're here for the night. Might as well make the most of it." As night fell, the hotel grew eerily quiet. The only sounds were the occasional drone of old pipes and the wind whispering against the windows. They sat on the bed, sharing a bottle of wine they'd brought with them, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over them since they checked in. "I can see why people think this place is haunted," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It feels different." Chris nodded. Old places like this hold on to things. Memories. Maybe even spirits. They finished their wine and settled into bed, pulling the heavy quilt over themselves. The room was cold, colder than it should have been for a summer night in Nevada. Chris turned off the light, and the room was swallowed by darkness, save for the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Hours passed, and the hotel remained deathly quiet. Chris drifted in and out of sleep, his mind heavy with strange dreams. In one, he was wandering the halls of the Mizpah, lost and confused, while soft whispers echoed all around him. At some point during the night, a faint sound pulled him from his sleep. He lay still, listening, trying to determine if it had been part of his dream. Then he heard it again, a soft knock at the door. He sat up, his heart pounding. Sarah stirred beside him. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. She blinked sleepily, nodding. "What was it?" "Someone's at the door," Chris said, his voice tense. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, moving cautiously toward the door. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. He hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door and pulling it open. The hallway outside was empty. Chris frowned, stepping out into the corridor. The dim light from the wall sconces cast long shadows on the crimson carpet, but there was no sign of anyone. The entire floor was silent, save for the faint creaking of the old building. He stepped back into the room and locked the door, his skin prickling with unease. "No one's there," he muttered. Sarah sat up, looking just as unsettled. "Are you sure? Maybe someone's playing a prank." Chris shook his head. "There's no one in the hall. Just nothing." They tried to settle back into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The room felt different now, heavier, as though something unseen had slipped in when he opened the door. Sarah shifted uneasily beside him, her breathing shallow and quick. Then came the whispering. At first, it was so faint that Chris thought it was his imagination. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder, unmistakable. It was the soft, breathy murmur of a woman's voice, speaking words he couldn't quite understand. Sarah clutched his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" Chris nodded, his heart hammering in his chest. He sat up, straining to make out the words. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls, swirling around them like a cold breeze. "Who's there?" Chris called out, his voice trembling. The whispering stopped. For a long moment, the room was silent again, save for the ragged sound of their breathing. Then, just as Chris was about to get out of bed, the mirror on the wall cracked, the sharp sound of splintering glass cutting through the air like a knife. They both froze, staring at the mirror in horror. A thin fracture ran across the glass, distorting their reflections. And then, in the dim light, they saw her. The figure of a woman stood in the reflection of the mirror, just behind them. She was dressed in a long, flowing red gown, her face pale and blurred, her eyes two dark voids. She was watching them, her head tilted slightly to the side, as though amused by their terror. Sarah let out a choked sob, scrambling out of bed. Chris grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. They fumbled with the lock, their hands shaking, and threw the door open, rushing out into the hallway. But the hall wasn't empty anymore. The lady in red stood at the end of the corridor, her figure barely illuminated by the faint light from the wall sconces. She moved toward them, her steps slow and deliberate, her gown swishing softly against the carpet. Chris and Sarah backed away, their hearts pounding in their chests. There was nowhere to go. The elevator was too far, and the stairwell was in the opposite direction. The lady in red drew closer, her dark eyes fixed on them, her presence suffocating. The air grew colder with every step she took, and the whispers returned, louder now, filling the corridor with their haunting melody. Chris glanced frantically at Sarah, his mind racing for a solution. But before he could move, the lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. In the pitch-black silence, the whispering stopped. And then, the knocking began again.